So yes, thank you very much. Really glad to be here, and so such an honour to follow Dimitri, who I agree with on practically everything. So that's very helpful for my presentation. I have very recently moved jobs, so I'll be referring to some of the work I was doing at Green Alliance, as well as some of the stuff I'm now going to be doing at WWF. So you'll have a taste of both of those campaigning organisations. That's okay. I've been given 45 minutes to talk about climate, the economics of climate change and sustainability. Normally in my job I get about 5 minutes to persuade a minister, if I'm lucky. So this is, a complete luxury, and I'm not actually planning to listen to myself for this long. I don't think I can stand it. So I'm going to get you to be a bit involved in this as well. So before the question and answer, I'd like to get you guys involved in talking about this. So firstly, if you're familiar with the SDGs, I know Mariana talked to you about those. This is SDG 12, which is about responsible consumption and production. So it's all about our material resource use. How does our economy produce things in a way that's sustainable? And the target for the SDG is by 2020 we should just manage to deal with our chemical waste in a responsible way. That's our aim for 2020. And by 2030 we should try and have a more sustainable use of resources, our food waste, and we should try and have a more circular use of resources by 2030. How are we doing? Pretty universally terribly. Most countries haven't even got a plan for how they're going to do this. We are, it's flashing red if it could flash red. You might be familiar with these kind of national footprint charts. This is something that WWF was involved in developing. Ecological footprint looks at carbon, but it also looks at fishing grounds, it looks at croplands, it looks at livestock, it looks at forest products. So if every country in the world, as a globe, we are living on 1.7 planets, but we, in the UK, are using about 3 planets, and the US, one of the richest countries in the world, is using about 5 planets. So our economy is fundamentally unsustainable in the way it's using its resources. And then if we looked at OECD data on just the availability of resources, the top line is demand for resources, bottom line is availability. OECD predicted analysed that over 1990 to 2015, we doubled our resource use, and they're expecting it to double again by 2050. The UK is a pretty high importer of materials. We don't have most of the materials that we need already. We're pretty exposed to volatile price movements. So over the next sort of 30 years, whatever's happening on policy for climate change, you're going to see stuff just running out. If we try and produce washing machines and cars and things for all the countries that have a growing middle class in the way we do it now, it will not work. It is not possible. And that's a pretty massive failure of capitalism. If I'm a company, I want to sell more people washing machines, but I can't do it if I produce them in the way I'm producing it now and just let the final washing machine go into landfill and all its materials be wasted. We can't keep doing things the way we do them. So before we get to the point that you have a gap, prices will react, supply chains will be interrupted, people will start investing in alternatives, and there's things that will happen that, apart from climate change, which we could just keep on putting more emissions in the climate change into the environment. Other things will start to break our system. And then the last one, which I like particularly because I think it just feels right, is there's an indicator that was developed around the SDGs and around this product, which is called project called Beyond GDP, which is called the Genuine Progress Indicator, and it looks at a wider measure of our economic progress. So GDP, traditional measures of GDP in blue, GPI in red, and what it says is, if you look at GPI, which has got GDP in it, but it's also got ecological footprint, biocapacity, it's also got human development index, a Gini coefficient about inequality in the world, and life satisfaction, you see that we peaked in our kind of overall well-being in about 1978. Since then, we've been pretty much flatlining, if not getting worse. So this is looking at data of 17 countries from 1950 to 2003. In the sort of mid-70s, our ecological footprint exceeded the capacity of the planet. That's when we started breaking the system. And surveys showed that our life satisfaction has not improved since the 70s. We haven't been getting any happier. We've been getting a bit richer, but we haven't been getting any happier. And this chart shows you the importance of the gap between GDP and GPI. But I think even more now, we could look at the fact, was it a predictor of what was going to happen to GDP? Because GDP is not doing so well. So our economy is fundamentally broken. We are not getting in the Western economies any richer. the path we're on is not sustainable. So if companies producing the same way aren't going to be able to carry on, and it's not improving our well-being. So some big things have to change. But policy doesn't just happen. This is, I think, follows on from what Dimitri was saying. There's an incredible amount you have to do to persuade politicians to do the things that seem obvious. And I'm going to talk about some of the practical side of this, I suppose, if you like. How do you get these issues addressed as a campaigning and advocacy organisation, somebody who's trying to influence things? And I suppose we aren't sitting here just thinking about climate change. There are so many problems we could be addressing. If you were sitting in an organisation that cared about homelessness or cared about illiteracy, there are huge problems to address all the time. Sometimes nothing happens on those problems. Nothing happens for a long time on lots of problems which we know about. And then sometimes when we decide to address a problem, we don't do the right thing. We do something because it feels like it's in your political tradition to do that, as opposed to there's any evidence to show it was going to be effective. So we always have to ask ourselves questions about who is pressing for change, who does this change help, who is it going to hurt, are you going to be able to persuade somebody to make those decisions, who is making your decision, are they even aware of the problem, do they know how to fix it? People don't like doing things, politicians don't like doing things where they don't have a solution. They don't like talking about problems that they can't then fix, particularly with an electoral cycle. And that makes things like climate change very, very problematic to deal with. So what's the role of economics in all this? And I phrase it as, what's the role of economics in winning the arguments, in the advocacy space? And I have set this out in terms of nothing very comprehensive, just my own experience, and it's been in the last couple of years, but I think it's very different to what you would have been doing as a campaigner before Kyoto, before Paris, before the Stern report, before the UK had a Climate Change Act. I think now we're very much in a case of saying, all this is happening, how do we do it well? We're in the case of saying, if you like it, there's this new game in town on the economy, how do we win it? We're talking to politicians about there's a new way that we are going to succeed in the world, and this is what it's like, and then persuading them that this is how we need to. So it's about that tipping point. So if you take each of them in the turn, the arguments seem to be around winning the future. So you need to persuade somebody that this is happening, and all that they're doing is either putting themselves, as Dimitri said in case of Trump, their own companies on the back foot. You can show that we're on this cusp of transformational change, that markets are already moving, that new economic opportunities are emerging that are going to replace other ones, not just because they're morally better, just because they're cheaper and more efficient, customers like them. And showing those things, I think, it's ridiculous how bad we are at predicting these changes. I mean, so I've got a couple of stats here, and you will have heard them before. But it's at the turn of the century, 1901, the world market for cars was estimated to be about 1 million at that point. And then, take it forward to 1968, we were massively wrong about cars. And it was still at that point, people thought there would be no market for Japanese cars in the US. They thought it would just never happen. We just failed to predict how things will change. In 1943, the chairman of IBM thought the world market for computers would be 5. That's what he predicted the global market for the computers he was developing would be. In 1977, we now have personal computers. Still at that point, CEO of a major corporation didn't think that everybody would have a computer. He thought it still would be a business thing. We just massively get it wrong on technology every time. And it's knowing that we could tell the story about PV, but you can tell the story in every technology about how much we underestimate how those things are going to change. In terms of winning support, my philosophy has always been about not persuading somebody to care about what I care about, but persuading them that the thing they care about will be solved with my policy solution. So I've spent a lot of my time talking about why low carbon and resource efficiency is going to solve the productivity problem. Why is low carbon and resource efficiency going to help us reduce regional disparities and address the concerns of former industrial towns? Why is low carbon and resource efficiency going to help us with our exports and to grow exports in the UK? How is it going to help with clean air? It's all the things that are already in the politician's mind, rather than necessarily persuading them to care about what we care about. And then finally, in terms of winning action, one of the difficulties we have, because we are in a kind of generally a sort of neoliberal Western economic policy frame, is trying to persuade governments they should do something about problems in the economy. So overcoming the myth that markets will solve these things for themselves is a huge problem. And I think it's about understanding that things don't move by themselves, and they might not move in time. So markets might move, but they might move after we get to 5 degrees. I mean, we might solve the problem, but it will be too late. Like, you know, it's not good enough that it happens. It's got to happen at the right time. And that there's a role for government in enabling that kind of transformational change. So how do we tilt the playing field in favour of low carbon and environmental solutions? And that inertia, and I think like a kind of almost a dogmatic faith in markets as being the thing that will solve it, is a real problem. An example I would give there is in relation to energy efficiency. So energy efficiency saves businesses and it saves homes money. It's the most effective thing we could do to deal with climate change, but it's really, really hard to make it happen. And most of the political discourse or the economic discourse is, well, if it saves people money, they should do it themselves. Like, well, but they haven't, and they haven't done it for 20 years. So okay, let's move to the next conversation. Well, we tried the Green Deal and that didn't work. So okay, you tried one thing. Just because one thing didn't work doesn't mean nothing can work. Doesn't mean that we should just abandon that whole policy area and now do nothing in that area. And over that whole period where you're having this conversation about should we do anything, what's the effective thing to do, you have a whole set of incumbents who are in the industry, who are arguing for the status quo, who are arguing for exemptions from policy, arguing that their jobs that are in an industry that probably isn't even going to be there in 10 years need to be protected, as opposed to making space for a new industry which might be providing jobs for the next 50 years, which is, you know, which are much harder to see. And as we said, there's nobody there lobbying for them. So we're in all this kind of grinding conversation about how do we get change. And there's two bits to this. I think one is understanding that we're at this point of transformational change. And the next part is what do you do about it? So in terms of transformational change, if you can see that, this is, I think, what you're also going to see next week from Carlota Perez. So I won't go into it in too much detail, but her historical analysis has shown that over the last 4 industrial technological revolutions, and we're in the 5th one now, you have this period of growth. Then you have a kind of a frenzy, and then you have a collapse and a crash. And then you go through relearning, growth and maturity again. And we are in probably a phase now in an information, digitalization, development and crash. But our crash is different. And Dimitri, you didn't talk about it, but in your chapter in Rethinking Capitalism, I think there's some really important points about this crash which are different. And the carbon crash we're experiencing isn't one that can be solved with one piece of technology. It's a crash that is much more about fundamentally changing processes. It's much more like, in my mind, much more like kind of emancipation of slavery, or it's like it changes everything. It changes the whole way we do things. Like, are we going to have child labour anymore? Are we going to have slavery anymore? It's like we've just decided not to do it, and now we need to come up with a whole new way of doing things. And actually, that can be much better for our economy, but we just haven't worked it out yet. So the challenge for us is in this final phase, in this kind of question mark we're in now. How do we use information? How do we use knowledge? How do we use all our digital technologies that we're developing to decarbonise, to dematerialise our economy, to circularize our production? And these are things that we can do, and some companies are on the cusp of doing it, but we are not making it a mission to do that for the economy. We're sort of, seeing what things will happen, as opposed to directing change and supporting companies that are doing things in that way. And the second part of what I want to talk about is a bit about what do you do about it. And here I think I want to say a word in defence of market failure, which I know Mariana's not a fan of, and I understand why. I came into economics as a deep green teen, thinking, well, this is, I need to understand economics because this is where all the decisions are being made, and it doesn't make sense that these things aren't working. And so I was obsessed with market failures when I started understanding. And I think people, they are not used very well and not enormously understood in government. So I think it is worth us understanding them. But Mariana's absolutely right. Markets are not a natural phenomenon. This is not the way it is. They are shaped by our laws and by our institutions. But even within that frame, neoclassical economists knew that markets had limits. And it's quite important to remember that, because lots of people who claim they're now neoclassical economists forget about all this stuff. They just remember that markets are great and forget about all the problems that have been identified with them. So first of all, let's just say, what is a perfect market? So a perfect market, apart from having the rational individual, goods are completely homogeneous. So everything's the same. There's no difference between goods. We all have perfect information. There's no barriers to entry into any market. There's no economies of scale. There's infinite number of suppliers and customers that nobody can influence the market. Does anybody recognise any of this? Sound like anything that you recognise in any? I mean, I would say that if you understand what perfect competition is and understand what market failure is, it's a big route telling you that markets are failing all of the time. Pick your choice. How are they failing, and which ones do you want to address? It's not a. Is there a market failure? Yes, there's definitely a market failure. There's always going to be a market failure. Which ones do you want to tackle, and how do you want to tackle them? So I take this very big view of market failures. And it's not a case of saying, let's wait for something to go wrong. Market failure is waiting for something to go wrong. It's not a symptom. It's not a disease. It's like the structure. You could predict at the start it's not going to work because all of these factors don't exist. It's not going to be something that can work without regulation, without taxation, without government spending in particular areas to do things. So this is a project, a graph I put together for a natural environment project actually, but I've just taken some of the things out to make it a little bit more relevant for the climate change. But just going down the column of market failures, lack of property rights. So if somebody doesn't own something, it's very hard for them to sell it. So there's lots of things that exist in environmental sector where nobody really owns things. So fish stocks, traffic congestion are things where it just doesn't work very well. Markets won't solve those problems very well. You could also argue our atmosphere is something that nobody really owns. So putting pollution into the atmosphere is a thing that nobody gets to say, you're not allowed to do that. Intergenerational allocations. So there are stocks of things that we use up, which won't be available to the next set of people to use up. Forests, biodiversity potentially, some of which we don't even know how valuable it is to us. Extractive industries that we're using, those are things where we're making decisions that are going to affect more than just us. Positive externalities, and you've heard of that phrase, is where when I buy something, I am only getting the benefits that I privately get, but there's also all sorts of other benefits to society which I don't know or receive. So I don't buy as much of that thing as would be good for society. So I buy honey because I like honey on my toast, but I'm not really thinking about the fact that pollination for all of agriculture is really important. So maybe I should buy more honey. I mean, those kind of things don't factor into what a beekeeper who's sitting there, or somebody who's going to take away some bat habitat or anything else that's a pollinator. Those things aren't factored in because it's just a sort of a free service that nobody pays for. Negative externalities, which we're much more familiar with because of the pollution and climate change conversation, is where I buy something, you sell it to me, and there's this other cost that neither of us have to worry about, which is impacting on the rest of society, and it means that market transaction will very likely be something that's not optimal for society. So you'll choose to sell me something which will have a pollution consequence for probably the place you're creating it, and I end up with my lovely product, and I don't have to worry about that. Public goods, which is a phrase you might come across. Public goods in this sense is goods as in goods and services, not goods as in good and bad. Things that we all receive together. So it would be very hard for me to sell you a lighthouse service, because if you didn't pay for that lighthouse service and you sailed around the corner, you could still see my lighthouse. So if I try and have a commercial lighthouse service, pretty soon all my customers realise they don't need to pay me, and then the whole market falls apart. So it's not that it's not a really good thing to have, and we should definitely have it, but it's quite hard to do that. Knowledge is a kind of a similar type of public good. If I invested in inventing something, pretty soon everybody would know about that. So I would put a lot of hard work in, and you will all benefit for free. So you will all go, oh, actually, I won't bother doing that. I'll wait for Angela to do it, and then I won't have had to put so much effort in. And so there'll be all these problems in doing things that we're really, really good for society because they don't quite work in that market-orientated way. Information failures are just endemic everywhere. So if markets work, they work because people can make really good choices. We don't have time in our lives to make choices about everything. I mean, you can make some choices about some things, but most things you don't have time to. But then even beyond that, sometimes you just don't have enough information to decide about whether you want to buy this piece of beef or that. Would you want to buy this particular drug? I mean, how would you possibly know? If you had a completely private health service and a doctor was advising you to buy something, you would buy it. You have got no ability to second guess that advice. So some are areas where information failures are absolutely endemic and government has to step in and provide you some information. And then merit goods are the last one, which is somewhat like a positive externality, but usually it's for you. So we don't buy enough for ourselves. Health, education. We realise it's somewhat good, but we don't realise how good it is for us. So those are the types of things that are market failures. And I think the reason they are important to understand is because in having conversations with policymakers, they not only say what the problem is, they point to the type of thing you might do to solve it. So if there are a lack of property rights, the thing you need to do is somehow come into that market and establish some kind of quasi-property right. So you give quotas, so you know, for fishing, so, or you establish a kind of a cap and trade system on the number of emissions that go into the environment, because you're sort of trying to do something which gives a level of ownership to fish or quality of air. A sovereign wealth fund at the end here is an example of oil-rich nations tend to generally, when they are getting the proceeds of their oil wealth, put something aside for the future, because basically you are benefiting more than is reasonable for your generation from something that you just happen to be extracting, but that's actually something that your country should benefit from over a number of years. And then something like an energy efficiency campaign there's an information failure, which means that information, advice, is going to be something that government should step in and do, because you know that is not going to be it's not going to be within most businesses, particularly small businesses, providers, to kind of run around finding out how to make themselves more energy efficient. They're busy making shoes, building car parts. The piece of work they need to do to find out how they're going to digitalise their energy use is not going to be something that's first on the list, and so you need to step in and find out how those things might help them. So in terms of achieving change, there are steps we can take, but there is a lot we have to do. So this is supposed to say we are the generation. And then there's a lot hanging on this generation to do quite a lot in relation to climate change, but also other environmental factors. And we constantly ask ourselves in a campaigning organisation, what are the things that can be achieved right now? Can we achieve a big step, or can we achieve a small step? Is that step taking us in the right direction? How do we create moments for change? And sometimes those moments are about being consistent with what are the issues that are exercising politicians at the moment. So we are sitting here today at 4:30 on Tuesday. There's going to be a Brexit vote in Parliament this evening, I think, still happening. Whatever happens, I pretty much can guarantee we will be talking about Brexit for at least another couple of years, guarantee it, no matter what happens today. The UK bandwidth on thinking about anything else is incredibly narrow. But as we've set out, environmental problems can't wait. We haven't got 2 years to wait to sort out climate change. You can barely have a conversation about anything else apart from Brexit in the UK at the moment. If you were looking around, if you were sitting in an environmental organisation and working on climate change, I'll start with the good news, the happy side. What things would you be looking around at that would give you hope, or you would think would be a kind of a hook that you would want to use to engage politicians in thinking about setting some ambitious targets, industrial change? What would you look for?
Children striking in school.
That made me so happy. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, apart from anything else, it's a next set of voters. I mean, politicians, I heard from the guys who went down there, they said politicians should have been properly scared. The kids were informed, they were active. This is not something they're going to forget about in, the 2-3 years it takes for them to get a vote. Absolutely. So anything else that people?
Entrepreneurial spirit. So for example, a lot of travelers that are building boats to collect all the plastic in the oceans.
Yep. So there's things that are happening. People are kind of almost doing it for themselves. I mean, those, I don't know if is that a commercial service they're providing, or are they?
So I mean, there are many business. I read about 2 business plans to create those boats, but they need investment and everything. So it's still in progress.
Excellent. So I mean, there's things people are dealing with problems already without government support. Yes.
You did make yourself part of the Brexit conversation. So a lot of our rules currently guiding the level of ambition we have on energy efficiency comes from the EU.
Yeah. So there's a challenge that somebody put to us as an environmental, or Green Alliance as an environmental organisation, was that we had sat back for too long, and the fact that all these EU directives had been driving policy on eco-design and energy efficiency, we hadn't been making the case to the British population about why we needed those things, and now we needed to get off our arses and start doing that, because basically they were all in threat of being lost. And although practically every single one of those laws will be transferred over, there's now a process where the minister, with a strike of a pen, can change those things, and that can happen in a much easier way than it could ever happen when we were in Europe. And so, you know, we need to start making the case for those things, and that is not a bad thing. It's a pain to have to do it because you thought you've already won them, and there were some next things you had to win, but you kind of go back to the beginning and start again with the stuff we had before. But it's an important lesson. So yeah, there's some things that are making us feel hopeful in terms of big threats. I'm looking to you for populism again, because that's one of the big ones. But any other big threats that people?
Maybe it links with like conspiracy theories, people not believing in.
That's a really that's a really good point. So we're at a stage where most of our advocates have been scientists and experts, and there's just so much. It's so hard to penetrate the news with those types of things at the moment. And yeah, anybody else? You don't have to. It's okay. I'd say populism is a huge issue.
The thing is, it's linked to that, but I don't know if it's a threat or more of a shortcoming. But the fact that a lot of left-wing movements that are traditionally the ones who push towards policies that against climate change are distancing themselves from their electors and from the working class and from their traditional support base, and failing to capture that.
And I think there's parts of that movement which are very much about climate change isn't necessarily part of it. So it's about workers' rights. It's about it's about changing the economic system. I don't think climate has really penetrated that as a movement, and that's a problem for the environment movement if that's something that starts moving the agenda and we're not part of it. So in terms of one of the tools that we use, this is called the policy funnel. If you ever go to a Green Alliance meeting, you will see it, but it's actually from E3G. Nick may be there, I think, that first developed this. What it says is there are different stages you go through in trying to achieve policy change. So first of all, the concept, the general idea of what you're even talking about has to be out in the world, and whose reputation, who is going to be the advocate for that to get it out in the world. Then you have to get it involved in the public debate. You have to get that concept being discussed. You have to form coalitions, frame the discussions, start getting people involved in a conversation about why this issue is important right now. Then when you get into a little bit further into the process, you actually have got some mandate for change. You need to have solutions to actual problems. You need to have some policy mechanisms. And you need to have champions who are either the politicians or somebody who can influence the politicians doing that work for you. And then get down to final decisions. It's a very much kind of hard bargaining of who's going to win, who's going to lose, how are we going to get this through, who is going to, who can I speak to, who's got access to which minister and which budgets to make these things happen. And some pretty hard bargaining to get things through the final. I'm not very often involved in that part of the world, but that's the kind of perspective we use. And if you're going through this process, you're going through it with a whole set of people who don't agree with you on climate change necessarily. They don't necessarily have your political philosophy. They don't necessarily agree that we're at a tipping point. Who knows what they do? So you have to use every argument in your armory to get through this. To get through this thing. And one of the things I just found was interesting, I put it on the reading list, was there was an Economist article which was talking about new millennials and socialism, which I read, which I just kind of made steam come out of my ears. But I read The Economist regularly just to kind of annoy myself. But it has recently started accepting that climate change is a problem we should address. That's huge for them. But it has still not accepting the prescriptions. It's still very much in the place that it sees. It was a I think an incredibly patronising response to millennials. First of all, casting all socialism as the opposite to capitalism. So as if socialism was a planned economy, whereas most socialists in this frame, political socialists, are talking about a bigger role for the state. They're not talking about let's move to planned economies. And then it was just basically trying to frame the whole debate as something that was people had been duped into thinking that a socialist response was the right response to climate change, and that the establishment frame needed to be reasserted to fix this. And it's really interesting that you kind of go through these conversations, and you could probably get lots of people who agree with climate change to get as far as the public debate, but when you get into the policy processes, that's where we are most of it. That's where you've got some real difficulty. What do we do about these things? How do we solve these problems? So remember this, because we're going to come back to it a couple of times. But I want to give you a couple of project examples, and I'll do these very quickly. And I'll say a little bit about the project context, give you some of the economic issues we addressed, and then I want to get your view on them. So first one is industrial strategy, which I know you've looked at already. So industrial strategy is essentially this kind of concept of accepting that the government's got a bigger role in the economy than just setting the right macroeconomic conditions for growth. So it's not just about setting interest rates and inflation, it's also about making sure the economy reaches its potential. So addressing what they call, oh, the slides have gone a bit funny, addressing the horizontal barriers, so things across the whole economy, startup, innovation, access to finance, things that affect everybody, and addressing vertical barriers, so things that happen in particular sectors, industrial development, clusters, demand conditions, things that disruption, competitiveness of the market in a particular sector. So that's a huge step for a Conservative government, which was the one that took forward an industrial strategy, to accept that it should intervene in the economy in that way. And it did it because essentially there was a productivity problem it could not ignore. So we talked about some of the environmental problems, and we looked at GPI, but this is what's happening to UK labour productivity since 2008. So we had been on a trend growth for over 10 years, and then in the last 10 years we've pretty much stagnated. That has major consequences for wages. It's got major consequences for investment, and we don't really even know this. This is called the productivity problem, productivity puzzle. We don't really even know what one single thing is the source of it. And this has led a Conservative government to adopt industrial strategy, put significant innovation spending, infrastructure spending into productivity growth. It's the responsibility of a new department, BEIS, which is the merged department of DEC and BIS. And it's where, because this is all happening in the context of Brexit, it's where the vision for the UK economy is now being formed. So, just an open question. In terms of risks and opportunities for climate change, what do you see as the issues for an environmental advocacy organisation of something like an industrial strategy? I know I can see people at the back who know the answer because they're involved in this process all the time. So I don't know if anybody else has got any thoughts. That if you were looking at an industrial strategy and it's pure economic policy, pretty much. It could, be just about productivity, but it's one of the areas I thought was really important, and Green Alliance thought was really important, because it essentially was determining quite a lot about our power and industrial emissions over the next 20 years, and the vision for our economy. And if it didn't have, and it was the place where BEIS, this new department, which was looking after energy and industrial strategy, was bringing together two pieces of our agenda that we really cared about. So I'm going to shoot ahead. The way we addressed that was we made the judgment, essentially, that we're never going to be able to persuade government that the objective of industrial strategy shouldn't be productivity, but we wanted to show that productivity growth depended pretty fundamentally on low carbon and industrial, low carbon and resource efficient growth. So if we look at the vertical and horizontal things I mentioned at the start, starting at the bottom, horizontal things right across the whole economy, there is a huge challenge to massively increase resource efficiency across the whole economy. Reduce energy use, reduce dependence on scarce materials. Manufacturing in the UK, which is relatively high cost place to make things, is going to have to do things that are high design, that are incredibly efficient, incredibly smart. And energy intensive companies, and anybody who's got any estates or anything that uses energy is going to have to make energy and resource efficiency a core competence right across the economy. And so in terms of raising the baseline, this is something that it comes like having a website. Like if you are a business and you don't know how to do these things, you are not going to be in business. It's not going to be just about John Lewis and House of Fraser having a good, fashion line. If you also haven't managed to do, solar on your roof, you haven't managed to do energy management, you're not going to be in retail because it just won't be like that anymore. In terms of verticals, these individual sectors, and we just picked a couple of examples here, it is pretty much impossible to imagine how any industry, how any company could be in leadership position in the construction industry, for example, if it wasn't doing passive housing, if it wasn't doing low carbon concrete, if it wasn't thinking about how its buildings could be deconstructed and then reconstructed in the future. This is kind of just going to be basic stuff for all construction businesses. If you're in the finance sector, how are you going to be a leading finance sector if you're not doing carbon trading, green bonds, if you're not doing ethical portfolio investment? This is what that industry is going to look like. And so what we had to talk about was how are we going to have an industrial strategy that doesn't future-proof and say, tell me how the thing you want me to invest in for your sector is going to help you be a leading part of that sector when the world looks completely different. If you can't tell me that, then I'm not investing in you because business as usual doesn't cut it. And then the double down bit at the bottom, at the top, which is this kind of cloud, was effectively us saying, these are all the things you can do for the businesses, but there's a thing happening in the policy environment where it's a sort of a Venn diagram where we need to link together what we're buying as government, as government from in terms of the infrastructure we're buying, the building codes we're setting, the vehicle excise duties we set, all set the conditions for how suppliers in the UK can do better. So that is an overlap we need to pay a particular attention to. So if we both produce cars and set town planning policy, set charging infrastructure, we have got the opportunity to set competitiveness conditions such that our industry can take advantage of that. So if you were looking at this, that problem, where would you kind of put it in the policy funnel in terms of things that you would trying to influence? I mean, there's that kind of thought leadership of the discussion being even out there in the community. So a completely new idea, influencing public debate, influencing the policy process. Have a show of hands for where we think it is. If I go along the line, where do we think it's? I'm at the end. Sorry. Yeah. So it's kind of here, isn't it? It's in the kind of policy process bit where effectively there's a white paper. There's money being spent. There are champions you need who essentially need to be not environmental sector because we have no influence whatsoever. It needs to be businesses, unions, other people who can actually make a difference on this. I'm going to skip the next one because I don't think I've got time, which is a shame because it's my favourite. You can look at that later. Let's do this one. And then at WWF, I have just started, so excuse my very short introduction on this one, but WWF is involved in a project which, if any of you saw or saw the effect of Blue Planet, which came out last year, it was a natural history programme. We have them all the time in Britain. We do them very, very well. This one had actually a much more substantial look at the sustained consequences of human systems on nature. It looked at the acidification of oceans. It looked at lots of things, but marine plastics was the thing that really caught the popular imagination. And in the UK, that became a huge impetus to policy change that nobody was expecting, and that everybody in the environment sector had to kind of jump on and see how they could make it work. That piece of that effect was very heartening for WWF and a set of production companies that had already got together. So for the last 4 years, Silverback Productions, working with David Attenborough and the team who made all of the BBC natural history programmes, have been filming 8 episodes looking at the biosphere, but with a much more concentrated focus on human systems and the impact on it, which is something that natural history programmes have shied away from, or if they haven't shied away from them, they haven't been given the latitude within the kind of BBC primetime slot to address things that upset people. It's already hard enough when the deer doesn't make it away from the cheetah, to then also say, oh, and it's all, disastrous because of the environment. It's, there's only so much depressing stories you can put on the prime time slot. But they had latitude with Netflix to do this, and so there is a series coming out on the 5th of April 2019, which talks about the beauty of the planet, shows the amazing nature that we have, but it also shows some of the threats. And that's, we had a presentation from the producer, Alistair Fothergill, last week. It's absolutely amazing. But alongside the programme, there's this whole set of resources that are going to be made available to try and move people beyond seeing the programme into kind of action. And so I suppose this is one of the things that we'll be using in 2020, WWF will be using in 2020 to try and move popular opinion around how we deal with some of these problems and make it completely unacceptable not to deal with environmental problems. That's not an option. I suppose like the Copenhagen and Amsterdam cycling. So in terms of policy funnel, where does it fall for you? If we were general opinion, public debates, policy, are we further over? More that side, yes, yes, yes. So I agree. I think we're kind of much more in a, it's not new. None of this stuff is completely new to people. People understand that there's a plastics island that's formed in the kind of mid-Atlantic, and it's there because of our waste problems. They know that about the acidification, but this is about turning it into a debate where UK and international pressure actually sort of move things forward, and trying to learn the lessons of some of the plastics debate where we got fantastic action, but it was quite piecemeal and wasn't always enormously, it didn't match the scale of the problem. So, oh, they have got a bit funny. So this says it's not making a choice, is making a choice. So my conclusion would be essentially to say that economics has got an important role in evaluating what's wrong with the system and what we should do about it. And the way markets work now is not a force of nature that cannot be changed. We can absolutely change things, and government has got a very major role to do that. So to do that, we need to win the future, persuade people that tipping point has happened. We need to show how the things that we're delivering are good for other problems. So if we'd have gone through the last example, also showing how a low carbon economy can help rebalancing the economy, it can help manufacturing in former industrial towns, help clean air, deliver clean air, help deliver productivity growth. And then we need to win action. So we need to show there are things that we can do to address these problems and show how they can be successful. So that is where I will finish. Thank you.
Great.